Rome was a sleepy little town. I guarantee you that Alexander would turn his direction to the west and probably conquer Rome and all the Mediterranean if he hadn't died. But he did. Would our history have been different? We might be speaking Greek today. Good morning, everyone. Good to see y'all. Pat on the back again. We made it through chapters 1 and 2. Good job, everybody. We're ready for chapter 3. If we hurry, which is really, I don't ever hurry, do I? But if we hurry, we'll make it through chapter 3 today. We'll cover Alexander the Great and his successors called the Diadochi. So that should be interesting, I hope. So chapter 3, starring Alexander the Great. Show you this chart early on, 1 or 2, whatever. And this is the entire history of the Intertestament period. The Old Testament ends right here at the end of Artaxerxes' reign, who was the last Persian king of the Old Testament. And then we had these kings, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, Artaxerxes III, the fourth, and Darius III, kings of Persia, until another man comes along right here, Alexander the Great. Little short timeline in red right here. We're going to discuss him today. So last week we covered the Old Testament. It was basically the Persian period. We covered everything to the left of this line right here, to the left. The Persian kingdom lasted about 93 years, I think it was, from the end of the Old Testament until the beginning of Alexander the Great coming along and changing everything. So that's what happened. Here, I've blown this up. So Nehemiah was the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. At the end of the Old Testament, we saw a renaissance for the Jews. I mentioned this 2 or 3 times before. They rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, and they rediscovered the law. Things were pretty good for the Jews. The Persians were really good to the Jews. The Iranians, the Persians were good to the Jews. And the Jews were hanging out in Jerusalem and pretty happy with things. Things were going pretty good for them. Then the remainder of the kings are pretty good to the Jews, and then Alexander the Great comes along and takes Judea in 332 BC, and we'll discuss how that happened. And with him came along Hellenism, Greek thinking, Greek way of life, Greek language, those kinds of things. Next up, Alexander and the Diadochi. They were my favorite group when I was growing up. Alexander the Diadochi. I remember them very well. Alexander the Great, his successors were called the Diadochi. Now, there's a bunch of them. We're not going to cover all of them. I think there was 18 or so. I've got a chart with 10 of them. The main ones, and then it really boils down to 4, and then it really kind of boils down to 2 that we're interested in. This whole chart, remember, has been about Palestine. We're always interested in Palestine, which became known as Cold Syria during this time. Okay? Now, lots of other stuff going on in the world. I've tried to cover some of that. Lots of stuff going over in China. Of course, the Alexander Greek Empire expanding, whatever. But this chart concentrates on Palestine. So we don't see all the Diadochi here. We see the line of Ptolemies who ruled over Palestine. We see the line of Seleucids here in purple who ruled over Palestine. And then the Maccabees and then the Hasmoneans, but all in Palestine. But we're going to back up today. And we're going to look at the entire Greek or Macedonian kingdom. Macedon was a little territory just north of Greece. Okay, Philip II came from Macedon. Philip II being Alexander's father. So this is a blow up at that time. So Alexander the Great overthrew Darius III. Took him and his family. Eventually, Darius III ended up dying. Alexander the Great didn't live very long, and then his successors, the Ptolemies in Egypt, ruled over Palestine, and then the Seleucids of Syria ruled over Palestine until a name named Mattathias came along. We'll talk about the Ptolemies next week if things go well today. We'll talk about the Seleucids the following week. If we can get through the Ptolemies in 1 week, that'll be questionable. And then we'll talk about the Maccabees and then the Hasmoneans, where Papa Mac came along and overthrew the Seleucids or the Syrians. Okay, so that's in our future. Now, before we cover anything about the Greek kingdom, when you talk about the dreams in the book of Daniel. Now, we talked about these last week. These things in red here were the dreams of the Old Testament. Remember we talked about Nebuchadnezzar dreamed he saw this head of gold and the chest and arms of silver, and Daniel said to him, "You are this head of gold." And we talked about Nebuchadnezzar, that's all right. I am the head of gold. That's better than silver, brass, whatever. And we had a dream in Daniel chapter 7 where this head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian kingdom, was this eagle-winged lion in Daniel chapter 7. Today we're going to talk about things in green. Real specifically, we're going to talk about this first one in green. This Grecian empire, the belly and thighs of bronze in Daniel chapter 2, the leper with 4 wings and heads in Daniel chapter 7, and the goat with 1 horn, 4 horns that came out of that great horn, and then a little horn that came out of those 4 horns. And that's where we're going to spend our time today, is basically chapter 8 of Daniel. Now, let me go ahead and read. I'm going to read the whole chapter to you. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me at first. In the vision, I was looking and saw myself in Susa, the capital, in the province of Elam, and I was by the river Ulai. I looked up and saw a ram standing beside the river. It had 2 horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second. I saw the ram charging westwards and northwards and southwards. All beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became strong. As I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes. It came towards the ram with the 2 horns that I'd seen standing beside the river, and it ran at it with savage force. I saw it approaching the ram. It was enraged against it and struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns. The ram did not have power to withstand it. It threw the ram down to the ground and trampled upon it, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. Then the male goat grew exceedingly great. But at the height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. These were Cassander, we'll talk about him in a minute, Lysimachus, we'll talk about him in a minute, Seleucus the first Nicator, Ptolemy the first Soter. Those are the 4 horns that we're talking about right here. Out of one of them came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the beautiful land. It grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to the earth some of the host and some of the stars and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away from him and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Because of wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Then I heard a Holy One speaking. And another Holy One said to the one that spoke, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary and host to be trampled?" And he answered him, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I tried to understand it. Then someone appeared standing before me, having the appearance of a man, and I heard a human voice by the Allah calling, "Gabriel, help this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I became frightened and fell prostrate. But he said to me, "Understand, O mortal, that the vision is for the time of the end." As he was speaking to me, I fell into a trance, face to the ground. Then he touched me and set me on my feet. He said, "Listen, and I will tell you what will take place later in the period of wrath, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall be great. Without warning he will destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken, and not by human hands. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. As for you, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business. But I was dismayed by the vision and did not understand it. So, we see the dreams of Daniel 8. We see the Medo-Persian Empire, the ram with two horns. We see Alexander the Great coming along. He's the he-goat. He was the greatest of all time. So he was the goat in, G-O-A-T. He was also the goat in Daniel chapter 8. Now, we see that 2 verses are for Persia. This giant empire, there's only 2 verses dedicated to Persia. We see that 4 verses are dedicated to Alexander and the Diadochi. We see 6 verses that are dedicated to a man named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, one would think, if you're doing a prophecy, that you would devote a lot of ink to a man named Daniel. You think you'd devote a lot of ink toward the Persian kingdom, right? I mean, they were giant, they were magnificent, and then you devote more verses to a man named who? Antiochus IV Ephiphanes? Have you heard of him? Boy, he was important. Daniel tells us so, and we'll talk about him in 2 or 3 weeks from now. Okay, we're not going to talk about him yet. But let's talk about the rest of the prophecy. The desecration that it's talking about would last 2,300 evenings and mornings. We read in Daniel 8:14, if you read down another couple of verses. Okay? Most people believe that it's in bold here, that it's 1,150 evening sacrifices and 1,150 morning sacrifices, because he talks specifically about the sacrifices. Okay? So, some people believe that it's 2,300 days, which means 6 years, 140 days, which could mean from Antiochus' first conversion to Jerusalem in 170 BC to the cleansing of the temple in late 164 BC. Most commentators I read, and I tend to believe, that it's 1,150 days, 1,150 evening sacrifices. Now remember, the Jews started their day in the evening, right? At sundown. So it's evening and morning, that's a day. Evening and morning, another sacrifice day. Okay? So 1,150 evening sacrifices and 1,150 morning sacrifices. From the desecration of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes to the cleansing of the temple by the Maccabees. Now, we know in 1 Maccabees that the desecration of the temple happened on 15 Kislev, 167 BC. Now, remember the Jewish months? I think I have that next. Yeah, so here's Kislev right here. It's a lunar calendar. Remember, the Jewish calendar is a lunar, and this is Nisan years. So Kislev corresponds to our November-December time frame. So we know that it was on Kislev that this happened, on the 15th when it was desecrated. We know that it was cleansed on 25 Kislev, 164 BC. So I took those, and I converted them into there's a calculator here at my website, testamentpress.com, Jewish days, months, and years. So I took those dates and converted them to Gregorian dates. Now, this is fraught with all kinds of difficulty. We're taking a lunar calendar that's 2,400 years old and converting it to not just Julian, but converting it to Gregorian calendar. We're taking a lunar calendar, converting it to a solar calendar, and this is fraught with all kinds of difficulty. And every time I read a comment, I actually took 10 books out of my library at home and read about what they had to say about this. And every single one of them said, yeah, it's probably 1,150 days, evening sacrifices, and 1,150 morning sacrifices. But nobody really covered about coming up with this. They said, yeah, it's 1,150 days. But no one proved to me in those 10 books of what 1,150 days was. I said, you know what, maybe I'll go try to prove that to myself. It turned out to be a harder task than I thought, but here's my attempt at it at least. So I converted 15 Kislev to December 3rd, 167 BC. I converted 25 Kislev to December 17th, 164 BC. And I had to do that because I had to get Gregorian dates. And I took Gregorian dates, and I could go to a time and date calculator online and calculate the difference between those dates. So I come up with that minus that is 1,110 days. That's pretty close. That's pretty close to 1,150. I'm just 40 days off. That's not bad. That's really not bad for going from this lunar, way before they had any kind of intercalation of insertion of months of Adar. You know, the Adar is the insertion of the month on leap years. Well, every 2.7 years on average is when they inserted a month. So 1,110, I'm pretty good with that. That's pretty amazing. But I said to myself, you know what? This was before they actually had this intercalation inserting of this month of Adar. That happened in 395 AD, I think, is when that happened. So this was really hundreds of years before they did that official intercalation asserting that month of Adar in the Jewish calendar. But I said to myself, you know what? They had to have some sort of intercalation. They had to insert days somehow, because if you were going strictly by a lunar calendar, you start planting your crops in the spring one year, and you'd be planting them in the summer the next year, and you'd be planting them in the fall the next year, and then eventually you're going to be planting your crops in the winter if you don't fix these calendars, if you don't line up your lunar calendar to your solar calendar. That's a problem. So I said, they've got to insert something. I bet they inserted 40 days somewhere along there. Don't know. That's the closest I've ever seen of analysis of this 1,150 days, though. Again, in all the literature that I looked at in trying to come up with this, 1,110 days is pretty close, and I think they inserted some time in there, because I know they inserted time later when they came up with the month of Adar as the lunar intercalation month that they inserted. So, 1,150 days, probably pretty good. That's pretty amazing. Alexander the Great had this vision in 550 BC. We are not talking about events until 167 BC. Wow. That's 350 years later-ish. That's pretty cool. Now, whether we can figure it out or not exactly, it seems to me there were probably 1,150 days between these two events. Pretty cool. Since so much time was spent in Daniel's dream about Antiochus IV Ephiphanes, I'm going to talk about him very briefly. This is just parenthetical. Put in some parentheses in your brain, and we're going to stick them in those parentheses, and we're going to kind of move on with the rest of our story. But Antiochus Epiphanes was the 13th of the Seleucid rulers. He was the Adolf Hitler of his days, and he was very, 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 very bad to the Jews. We will cover him in 3 weeks or so. Okay? He did all these things to the Jews until Mattathias came along. I call him Papa Mac. He was the father of the Maccabee brothers, Judas, Jonathan, etc. Okay? And then with the Maccabees, the rebellion of the Maccabees, then comes the Hasmoneans, and then on into the Herodians, and we'll talk about that history as we go. All right, close your parentheses in your brain. Let's go back and talk about Alexander the Great. His daddy was Philip II. He was no slouch as a military guy either. He conquered all of Macedon and all of Greece. That's a pretty impressive achievement for the dad. He had actually plans to conquer Persia, but his plans were put on hold because somebody assassinated him in 336 BC. But anyway, his family tree looks like this. He was married 7 times, and go ahead and get a feel for how I do my charts here, these family trees, because this is a really, really simple one. And we're going to get into some really, really, really complex ones. When we start looking at the Ptolemies, we start looking at the Seleucids, the Herodians, those family trees get really, really ugly fast. But this one's simple, and dotted lines are marriages. This was his first marriage. That's what these numbers are on these dotted lines. Philip's first marriage was to Aldada, and they had this daughter. We know Aldada was a woman. He didn't marry any men back then. She was a woman because she's oval. I put in oval for female, so they had a daughter. He then married, next up was Phila, and eventually he married Olympias. Olympias is a very important woman in his life, his 4th wife, because she had Alexander the Great. And he married Roxana of Bactria, and then he married a couple of Persian women later on. And then Roxana had Alexander IV, their son. Philip also, his last wife, number 7, was Cleopatra Eurydice. She had a son and a daughter, Caranus and Europa. He didn't last very long, as we'll see. So Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, this is the region, the Macedonian Greece region right here, when Philip the Great came online as the king of Macedon. So he was up here in Macedon, this little light green area right here. And by the time he finished up, by the time he died in 336 BC, in 24 years, he had taken over the entire area that I show in green here. The entire southern end of the Balkan Peninsula. The Balkan Peninsula is this peninsula right here in south. So he took over the entire southern region of the Balkan Peninsula with the exception of Sparta, right there in yellow. These two regions, Epirus and the Aetolian League, were basically allies of his. He either controlled them or they were very strong allies of his. So he took over this entire region with the exception of Sparta and Persia, which is way over here, a giant kingdom to the right. Okay? Over here, when he started out, if you've taken Western civilization, you read about the Greek city-states. Anybody kind of remember that in Western civilization? The Greek city-states, the polis, or the police. A single is a polis, and the police is plural, if I'm pronouncing those right. Okay? So Plato said these Greek city-states were like frogs around a pond. There's a bunch of them. And the reason they were is because of the geography of Greece. There were mountains. So you have a polis here, and you'd have a mountain, and you have a polis here, and a mountain, and you have a polis here. So it really was driven by geography, these different city-states that came about. Well, Philip consolidated all those. Notice to the west, nothing much is happening. Carthage is pretty consistent. That's in purple here. Rome is still a sleepy little town. They're taking a little more territory. They take a little more down the coast in the 24 years of this animation. All right, so let's look at the animation. Starting in 359 BC, Philip takes Macedon. Or he is Macedon, basically, but he starts taking down the coast of Greece into the Balkan Peninsula. He takes everything except for Sparta down here in yellow. He takes all the way up here to the Danube River, and he takes all the way over here to the Bosphorus, just the Sea of Marmara right here. So this is the Bosphorus. Little waterway between the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. So he takes all this region. Again, he was no slouch. He was a pretty great military leader also. And one of his claims to fame is he came up with spears that were longer than the other guys. You can win if you do that, right? Pretty good strategy. So when they had their phalanx, which is these groups of men, they're standing in a million line, and they had their long spears. If your spears are longer than the other guys, you're going to win those battles, guaranteed every time. That was his claim to fame. And Alexander the Great continued that on as he conquered. So that is the taking by Philip of the regions. Now, I've blown this up where you can see it a little bit better. This is in my book on page 78. So Thrace up here was taken by Philip. And all these kingdoms right here, they were all regions controlled by or an ally of Philip II. So Thrace was an ally or controlled by him. Macedon, of course, was controlled by him. Thessaly, Epirus, the League of Corinth. Sparta was not. But notice the League of Corinth controlled all these islands in the Aegean Sea out here, which, anybody been on an Aegean cruise? That's where I want to go next, I hope, someday. So I want to cruise all these islands out here in the Aegean. But he controlled all those for the League of Corinth. Okay? Next up, Alexander the Great. Philip was assassinated in 336, and Alexander the Great takes over. He was, I mentioned, he was the goat of Daniel 8, and he was the greatest of all time. He was the goat. He was two goats, the greatest of all time. He was an amazing, amazing general. Now, the first map right here is in 336 BC, the time Philip died. The map is exactly the same, except I've blown it up. We were looking before, just this region right here. But to keep the map consistent across all the Alexander the Great's conquest, we had to really, really, really blow the map up. So we had to cover the entire Persian Empire, including Macedon and Greece over here. Okay? So let's look at that animation. Alexander the Great takes over, goes down to Egypt, takes over, boom, 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 boom. Takes over all the way over here past the Indus River into parts of the Indian subcontinent. Let that play a couple of times. The resolution, the maps that I'm using are 1 year apart. That's not enough resolution for what Alexander did. You need a month resolution, or you need a weak resolution to really see Alexander stepping across and taking all these lands. And that's what this does right here. If you're interested in this kind of thing, come up and look at this chart. Because you can't see it here, you can't see it in the chart that I'm going to show you here in just a minute, but I think you can see it in this chart. Okay? Alexander the Great was amazing. So let's look at some of the details of that. Again, this is hard to see, but there's a lot of information on there because he did amazing, amazing things. In the book, page 85, red arrows are even years of travel, purple arrows are odd years of travel, major sieges are stars, which you can't see, major battles are stars, major sieges are circles. Okay, so Alexander started out over here in Pella, the Macedonian capital, in 334 BC, and then he traveled along here. He had his first win against the Persians at the Granicus River in 334 BC, right here. Okay? Then he traveled south. He besieged Halicarnassus in 334. Then he traveled east. And then he had another conflict with Darius, and he captured Darius' family. The last king of the Persian Empire, Darius III, Alexander captured his family, and Darius went running. He wasn't completely done with Persia yet, but this was certainly a boding of things to come. Okay? Then he travels down the coast, down to a place that we're very familiar with, where Jerusalem is. Let me go ahead just a little bit, and I'm going to talk about when he came to Jerusalem. Now, so this is a blow-up of that little tiny square on that giant map we saw a minute ago. So first of all, Alexander besieged and conquered Tyre in 332 BC. When he was conquering Tyre, when he was besieging them, he sent out an emissary to Jaddua, the high priest in Jerusalem. And Alexander the Great asked him for men, and he asked him for supplies. And what did Jaddua do? He said no. Oh man, Jaddua. Do you know the history? Do you know how great Alexander the Great is? The name should alone, let him know that, this is not going to end well. Jaddua said no. And why did he say no? Because the Persians had been really, really, really good to the Jews. And Jaddua was a good guy, apparently. He was a man of character. And he said, no, I will not send you supplies to conquer the kings that have been so good to us. How do you think that ended for Jaddua? You might be surprised. Stay tuned, I'm going to tell you in just a minute. But first of all, back to Tyre. So Tyre, Alexander was conquering Tyre. He sent these emissaries to Jaddua. Jaddua said no. The emissaries came back. Alexander was furious. He was ready to go to Jerusalem right then and conquer Jerusalem. He said, I've almost got Tyre taken care of. And that's what this conquest looked like. This is Tyre today. It used to be this. It used to be an island until Alexander the Great came along and made it a peninsula. He built a big, big bridge out to Tyre so he could conquer the city. This is what it looked like in 1934, just mostly sand and rock. Again, today. And this is what it looked like, someone's depiction of where the old coastline was, of Tyre in white, and the moles, causeways that Alexander the Great built. So from January to July, he built this mole. He finally conquered the city, killed a bunch of people, sold a bunch of people into slavery, and that was the last time Tyre was an island, as we can see today in modern-day Lebanon. If Lebanon were a safe place to go, you could go there today. All right, so back to our previous chart. So that was Tyre. He finished that in 332 BC. He then went out and suppressed rebellions around Tyre, and then we see the story of Sanballat. And by the way, I have this in the book, but I kind of reworked it because there's a conflict between Josephus and the book of Nehemiah. So whether this was Sanballat, the grandson, or of the old Sanballat we read about in Nehemiah, we don't know for sure. But I kind of reworked this in the book. So if you're interested in seeing how I reworked this, go to the errata on testamentpress.com. So if I ever do a new version of the book, then I will probably put in this, my discussion here in the errata instead of what I have there in the book. So Samaria right here, initially accepted Alexander and said, yeah, okay, we give up, we're good, we accept your terms or whatever. And then Gaza fell down here in 332 BC. He sent out some forays against some Nabateans. I don't think he ever conquered the Nabateans. And then, after Gaza, oh boy, let's go see Jaddua. And let's teach Jaddua a lesson. Now, we don't know the real story. We do have a story as told by Josephus that Jaddua had a dream and Alexander had a same dream. And both these men, Jaddua dreamed that when Alexander the Great comes along, we should open the city gates and we should go out in white robes, the entire city. The entire city came out to meet Alexander on the road and to basically give up to him. Let's go out in our white robes, and they did. Alexander the Great had the same dream, according to Josephus. He had the dream that I would be greeted by a bunch of people in white robes from the city of Jerusalem, and that they would accept me. And his anger turned into, okay, Jerusalem's okay, Jaddua's okay. I can understand he's a man of character. I can understand, he didn't want to go against the Persian king, so I'm okay. His men probably weren't okay. They probably really wanted to plunder. Man, think of the treasure in Jerusalem. They were looking forward to that plunder. But Alexander the Great said, no, let's go into Jerusalem and let's talk to these guys. And it turned out, according to Josephus, that they read the prophecies of Daniel to him. And he learned that he was the belly and thighs of brass, if we can believe this story, that he was the leopard of Daniel 7, and that he was the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8. Now, wouldn't that be kind of cool to have a prophecy read to you about yourself? Pretty cool. Now, Alexander was good to the Jews, just like the Persians were. And we start to see a rift between Hellenism that Alexander the Great brought and Persianism, aka Orthodox Judaism, that the Jews were practicing at that point. And this became a conflict. And it started as a political conflict between Persia and Greece, and then it morphed into a cultural thing, Orthodoxy versus Hellenism. And then it morphed into a political, religious, cultural thing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees that we see in the New Testament. We're going to cover all that history. There's the morphing that happens. There's a lot of details there. We will cover that as we go along. Okay, but Alexander was good to the Jews, just like the Persians had been. Okay? Alexander then, when he went to Jerusalem, hung out there for a while, had the prophecies read to him, made friends with Jaddua and the other guys. He then took off to Egypt, way off the map here, down here, and he was welcomed by Egypt, and they even called him a pharaoh. So Alexander said, all right, I'm good. I'm a pharaoh now. Yay! Woo. And then he came back north through Palestine again. Samaria decided at that point, we don't like Alexander the Great after all. Let's rebel. Oh, don't do it, Samaria, don't do it. Well, he conquered them pretty quick. And then he took off north again to Tyre again, and then he headed off to conquer the rest of the entire world, as we see here. Again, so we've covered basically this little chunk of the chart. His southern route through Palestine over to Egypt, his northern route through Palestine, back to Tyre, and then over to conquer the rest of the world. So, number 6, Alexander defeated Darius III again at Guatemala in 331 BC, right here. Number 7, Alexander defeated the Persians at the Persian Gate in 330 BC, right here. I know you can't see that. That's why I want you to come look at this chart afterwards. Okay? Number 8, he then went up here to Sogdian Rock in 328 BC and besieged that. Number 9, he started defeating the kings of the far east, defeated King Porus at that river in 326 BC. And at that point, by the time he pushed into the subcontinent of India, his men said, you know what? We're tired of looting, we're tired of killing, let's go home and see our families. And they were serious about it, and it was pretty close to mutiny. And Alexander the Great finally agreed. He said, okay, we've conquered enough for now, let's go home and rest, see our families. And they did. They went home in 3 different routes. This 10A right here that you can't see, he sent part of his army back with Craterus to Carnea in 325 BC. That's this northern route returning back. Okay? He also had the fleet under Nearchus in 325 that returned back along the coast here. He and part of his army returned by the southern route to Carmana, and then Susa back on this red dotted line here. When they got back to Babylon, Alexander died. I always like asking questions, what-if questions in history. What if Alexander hadn't died? Well, over here off the map, Rome was a sleepy little town. I guarantee you that Alexander would turn his direction to the west and probably conquer Rome and all the Mediterranean if he hadn't died. But he did. Would our history have been different? We might be speaking Greek today. I don't know. If Alexander the Great had lived. Now, if we look back at his life, he was a man of contrast. He treated his captives very well. He treated Darius' family very well. The Jews were treated very well. But on the other side, he treated many prisoners brutally, often killing all the men and selling the women and children into slavery. A man of contrast. He was incredibly smart, but he was also given to drunken brawls. He murdered a man, Cletus, who had saved his life at the Battle of Granicus River. He burned down the Persian city after living there for several months. He ordered the murder of Philotas, the son of one of his most trusted generals, Parmenion. And then he later ordered Parmenion killed. He murdered one of his nephews. He had a good side and he had a bad side. He didn't want to get on his bad side. He was intensely loyal to Hellenistic Greek culture, but he also adopted Persian customs after his conquest of Persia. A man of contrast. One of the greatest leaders in history with detailed planning and reconnaissance of every stage of the battle, but he apparently didn't have a will. Everybody in here needs a will. We need to update ours. But he didn't have a will, and he died, and his kingdom fell apart. These are the Diadochi. I put 10 up in 2 charts. These are the main ones. There's probably 18 or so. Perdiccas was one of Alexander's generals. He became a regent of Alexander's empire after his death. Eumenes was the royal secretary to Alexander. Cratius and other was generals. Antigonus, Antipater, and Polyperchon. He became a regent of Alexander's empire after the death of Antipater. Okay, so those are some of the. If you want to study the Diadochi, there's not a whole lot of material out there on them, and it's a pretty complex subject. Okay, so when you study that, you need to go really delve into it. It's a really, really complex thing. The 4 that are the horns are here. Cassander, one of the horns of Daniel chapter 8. He was the son of Antipater, the only one of the Diadochi outwardly hostile to Alexander's memory. And I'm going to show you 2 different philosophies here in just a minute. Lysimachus, he established the Attalid dynasty, and that name comes from the first king, King Attalus, who ruled from 241 to a very long reign, almost 50 years. Ptolemy, we're going to learn a lot about Ptolemy and his descendants when we look at the Ptolemaic or the Egyptian Empire. And Seleucus and his descendants when we look at the Seleucid or the Greek or the Syrian Empire. Okay? So, 2 schools of thought when the Diadochi came around. So Alexander died, and it's rumored that someone asked him, who do you want to rule your kingdom after you're obviously going to die? Who do you want to rule after you're dead? And someone, I don't know if this is real or not, or somebody just wrote it, but Alexander said, the strongest. Well, all 18 of these guys thought they were the strongest, of course, And they, of course, went into wars. There were 4 Diadochi wars. We'll cover those very briefly in a minute. But the 2 general schools of thought, some wanted to keep the Greek Empire completely intact under the bloodline of Alexander the Great. He had a mentally unfit or maybe epileptic half-brother, Philip III Arrhidaeus. If you go back to this chart here, Philip, right here, his half-brother, 2 different wives by Philip, his half-brother Philip, or the third, Arrhidaeus. He had a son who was not born. He was born about 2 months after Alexander died, but Alexander IV here was born to his wife, Roxana of Bactria. Okay? He had another half-brother, Caranus, up here through Philip's last wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, who had this son here. Okay? Perdiccas, who was one of the Diadochi, kind of went along with this philosophy. He became the regent of the empire shortly after Alexander died. And his goal was to be the guy in charge, but really Philip Arrhidaeus was really the ruler. Alexander IV, when he was born, he was a baby, but he was really kind of the ruler. And even Caranus, he didn't last very long. He's a ruler. So that was the philosophy, one of the schools of philosophy. Let's let the bloodline of Alexander continue to rule. Another philosophy is, forget the bloodline. Let's do everything on our own. And Ptolemy the First Soter, probably the most exemplified this philosophy. Very soon after Alexander the Great died, Ptolemy went to Egypt and he planted himself there and he said, I'm good with Egypt. Y'all do your thing. I mean, he participated in some of the Diadochi wars, but he just planted himself in Egypt, and that's where his descendants grew and grew and grew until Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra, that we'll read about, who was taken over by Rome in 31 BC. Okay? So he took Egypt and Alexander's body, and he solidified his control over the region. So two different philosophies of the Diadochi. There were three distinct periods of the Diadochi. There was the United Kingdom, kind of like the Jews. We had the United Kingdom under Saul, David, Solomon, 40 years apiece, 120 years. We then have the divided kingdom. So similar to that we saw with the Jews, but the same thing with the Greeks. We had the United Kingdom under Philip and Alexander the Great. We had the Transitional Kingdom where there's a bunch of wars. There's a lot of detail right here in these Diadochi wars. And then we had the divided kingdom that really became permanent after the bloodline successors passed away. And when I say passed away, they were forced into passing away. And I hope we might get to that. So here's the timeline of the Greek Empire. So Philip and Alexander up here. Philip, Alexander, and the United Kingdom. Okay. When Alexander died in 323 BC, we see Alexander IV, the child king, how long he lived until he was killed. We see Arrhidaeus, Alexander's half-brother, and then we see these people in red who were regents. They were the ones that were kind of trying to keep the bloodline of Alexander going. Okay, and again, we had the guys move off. Ptolemy I, Lysimachus, etc., kind of moved off and did their own thing. And then by the time all these guys die, we see all his descendants die, then everything just completely falls apart, and everybody goes and does their own thing. So by the time Alexander died, here's another last animation. Let me do this real quick. By the time he died, we start here with the Diadochi controlling all of this area because of Alexander the Great. By the time he died, Greece was starting to go back to smaller kingdoms, almost like city-states again. The Seleucids took over a giant realm territory, the Ptolemies down here in the south, Antigonus, the Antigonid dynasty here on Asia Minor. So let me do that animation, then we'll call it a day. Okay? Alexander's kingdom starts falling apart. Slowly at first, and then all of a sudden, as you'll see. 308 BC, 307, 6, boom, right there. That's when everybody decided, all these bloodline successors had passed away. They were killed. I'll show you that next week. And then we have the kingdom breaking up into its pieces. Thank you all for being here very much. I thought we might get all this covered, but we do have a few more slides to do to finish up the Greeks, and then we will jump into the Ptolemies next week. Oh, the history gets uglier with the Ptolemies. Thank you all.